everyone, and welcome to the Algonox official YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to be talking about how to create a crowdfunding application. So what the application is going to do is going to be to help a particular wallet address to raise funds, and then the creator of the smart contract would be the one to approve that the funds are sent from the smart contract to the wallet address that is intended for the fundraising. So first of all, as earlier stated, all ASC Builder smart contracts begin with methods and then variables and then nodes. So we would first create two methods. The one for receiving funds, we would call it receive_funds, and then we would create another method and we would call it disburse funds. So having created these two methods, the next line of action would be to create the various variables for the receive funds method. So we would focus on each of the methods one by one. So looking at the variable section, that is where we're going to focus on and add the variables that we need. So first of all, the receive funds method is going to take two application calls that are going to be application call, and then the next one is going to be a payment transaction. So we would add, there are a lot of fields that we have to take into consideration and checks to ensure that it is safe and it goes through smoothly. One of them is the requito and the other is the close remainder to it. They have to both point to the zero address, and then we also have to check for the amount that is up to at least 0.1 algo, and we also need to check the type of transactions that are being sent, that they are application call and payment transaction respectively. So the first variable we'll create here is a transaction type. So we would label the two transactions as TXNA and TXNB. So the TXNA type enum, we would call the first one application call, and then we would create another variable which is a transaction type. You would say TXNB type enum, and then we would call it payment. So what we'll do next is to focus on the individual transactions, but before then we would create the variable for the zero address. So we want to get a global field which is zero address, and then we would choose the zero address here. That is where two of the fields for the TXNB are going to point to. So the next variable we are going to create is each of the TXNB types, like the type enum for each of them, and then we would create the group transaction field. So we would call it TXNA type, and that is 0. It would be transaction type. And then we would add another variable which is TXNB type. So we'd call it TXNB type, and then that is 1. That will be transaction type. And then we would also check for TXNB amount. So we would check for GTXN field, which is TXNB amount. So that is 1, and then we would choose asset amount, which is algo amount in this case, and then Okay, so we would add the TXN. We would add the value for the minimum amount to be sent. So it would be an integer. We would call it minimum amount to send, and it would be 0.1 algo, which is 10 to the power of 5 micro algo, min amounts to send. And then we also want to check for the group size. So we will get a global field which is group size, so the group size is going to be global transaction group size. Okay, so having set this, we would have to check if the group size is equal to 2. So we would add a variable for integer, which is size, and we would use 2, which we'll be using to compare to the group size. So when having had all these things set in place, we will then construct our decision. So our decision is going to be in the sort of decision, and then we would have to add the met node as earlier mentioned, and we would have to add the routine for else. So the met node is going to have an AND conditional. So the AND conditional is going to have a set of conditions. So the first, we'll be checking for the group size first. So we would add a condition. So we would say TXNA type enum is equal to TXNA type. Then we'd also add another condition, TXNB type enum, and it would be TXNB type. So we've checked the two types, and then we would check if we would also check if the 0 address is equal to the TXN. Okay, we need to create the close remainder to and key to for each of them. So we would create a variable which is going to be a grouped transaction field. So we would say rekeyto TXNB rekeyto. So that is 1, and we would set rekeyto, and we would also add another variable which is a group transaction field again. So TXNB close remainder to, and then that would be close remainder to. So what we are doing here, the indexes of the transactions in every group starts from 0. So we start from 0, 1, 2, 3 till infinity. So what we would also do now is to check if the TXNB rekeyto is equal to the TXNB, the 0 address. And we also have to check if the TXNB rekeyto is equal to the 0 address. So if you look at the properties, okay, I think we've created that already. So we remove the node, and then we would add a condition saying txnb close remainder to is equal to the 0 address. Yeah, so we've gotten that, and then we would also need to check the txnb amount if the amount is greater than or equal to the minimum amount to send. So we'll do that by adding a condition. You have to look at the variables txnb amount. txnb amount is equal to the min amount to send. So in ASC Builder, you have to be conscious of the variable casing. The character casing is very important, and the spelling, you should make sure that your spellings are correct. So what we typically do, if we were to build it step by step, what we would typically do is to add each of the variables at the time we need them so that we won't get confused. So when we create each component and we need a variable, we would have to create that variable on the fly anytime we need it. So I think this is what we do next. And then the next thing we want to check for, I think we've done all our checks. So the next thing would be to add the routine that would accept the transaction. So we would add an action which is approve transaction, and then for this other routine we'd add an action which is to reject the transaction if these conditions are not met. So once these conditions are met, then we could actually do it. And yes, we haven't created the variable for the wallet to send the funds to. So what we would do is we would simply add a global, and then that global would be an address. So I'll just copy my address in my account, which I would use to add as the receiver of the fund. So what we'll do is to create a global which is an address, and we'll say remittance address. So we'll be using this to actually check when we are doing the disbursement. So the next thing we'll do is to go through our code and make sure that everything is set. So we'll check each of the conditions and look at the properties at the right. We'll see that each of them are met. Okay, so for the TXN amount, I think we need to check if it's greater than or equal to the minimum amount to send. So we'd add a condition which is TXN B amount is greater than or equal to the minimum amount to send. So that is what we'll do instead of using equal to. So once we are sure of what we want to do, we can then proceed to the other part. So what we have to do is, for the remittance address, we need to actually add the address to our txn.accounts, which we'll focus on later. And to be safe, we could actually delete this state from here, so it is only added to the creator. So the creator of the smart contract can actually decide on if he or she wants to decide on which address he or she wants to send the funds to by including it in the accounts when calling the app. So when we go to the disburse funds route, there are okay, we'll just check for one thing, which is the group size. We want to make sure it's equal to 1, and we also need to make sure that the sender of that transaction is equal to the creator address. So we would add a decision, and then we'd add a met node, and then we'd add the routine as usual. So for the met node, we would want to check some parameters. So we would go to the variable section, and then we'd add a variable which is an address. So we'd call it CXN sender, and we call it the sender. And then we add another variable which is an address, creator address. So we've added the two of them, and then we also need to add a variable to hold the group size of this particular transaction, and that variable is going to be an integer, which is we'll call it 1, and we just use 1 as the value. So since we have the group size already here, we'll just add two conditions. So the first condition, we would have to add an AND conditional, so that the list of conditions here equally have to be met. And so we'll add a condition which is going to be that the group size must be equal to 1, and we'll also add another condition that the TXN sender must be equal to the creator address. So once that is done, we would add a routine for our met node, and what we want to do is to send algo. But before then, we would have to consider the minimum balance of the smart contract, which is the amount that must remain in its balance after a transfer. That would be typically 0.1. But then we would have to reference that for our computation, so that in coming tutorial series, it would be easy to understand why we do that and why we must do that. So for this routine, we would add two variables, which would be the minimum balance. So the minimum balance is going to hold the mean balance of the smart contract. So the mean balance, we would have to get the address of the application. So we would get a variable which is a global field, which is the application address. So global.application address, and then we would also add the variable now, and the variable is going to be mean balance. So the variable name is going to be mean balance, and it's going to reference the application address. So we've added the mean balance for the smart contract, and then we want to get the total balance, so that we're going to subtract it by the mean balance, so that whatever remains is what we are going to send to the address for disbursement. So since we had created the address, we could just go ahead to create an address, and then we'll call it disburse to. We'll just add an address here. So we have the disburse to variable, and then we could create a variable which is the asset holding, and it would be balance for the account, which is application address. So we want to get the algo balance. So once that is done, we want to do an arithmetic operation. So we would use one which is withdrawable balance. So the variable we're going to add is a miscellaneous variable, which is withdrawable balance, which is going to be an arithmetic operation, which is going to be balance minus mean balance. So we have that in our application. So what we'll do now is to do an asset transfer, which is an algo transfer from the contract to the disburse to address. So we would add a variable which is, okay, we would add an action. The node we are going to add is an action. So we would first want to reject this transaction, so I'll quickly add a reject transaction node. And then for this routine, we would now add an action node, which is to send algo. So the address to send to is the disburse to address, and then the variable for the amount we want to send is the withdrawable balance. So we want to send everything in the smart contract balance to the disburse to address, and then we want to approve the transaction so that it gets committed to the blockchain. So yeah, we are done with the application. So now we can look at, we can create our, we can compile our code to Python so that we can see our results. And here we go, we've written our first complex smart contract code, and so far it's looking good. It's looking good. And then we have different routes here, so we can actually deploy this to the blockchain, and then our application is going to execute itself as it's supposed to. So now that we've built our crowdfunding demo, I think we could actually proceed to our next tutorial. So when next we post a tutorial, you would sure have to come and check out the tutorial and then get to know more about ASC Builder. So I would urge you to like this video, subscribe, and then turn on the notification for our channel so that you keep getting more updates on our videos that we'll be posting. And at this juncture, we would say thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.